This weekend, I have been dealing with medication ramp up issues, and one of those fun side effects that I get to deal with is disassociation and derealization. That's when you do not feel connected to your body. You are unsure if the world around you is real, or if it is part of some delusion. Thankfully, at this point in my life, I have a lot of coping mechanisms for that. It's something that does happen occasionally, but I am firmly enough rooted in healthy coping tools to be able to combat that. And, for the most part, it's just little fleeting moments of, am I really here? Really here? So as I'm sitting around going, okay, so this is going to be the next few days. We're just going to, prepare and be aware and just make sure we continue to ground ourselves, and everything will be fine. Once we get reacclimated to the dosage of the meds, everything will smooth out. We just have a couple of days of fun. My therapist does not understand my dark, sarcastic use of the word fun. But it got me thinking. Back when I was in college, I took an honors course that was a philosophy class, a history class, a humanities class, and then like a weekly class that would tie it all together and look at how the philosophy and religion and art and wars, immigrations, migrations, etc. impacted different things within culture and how the mind worked and how people saw the world. Fantastic course. Cannot say enough good things about it. It was, I think, essential for me. It's one of those moments that, kind of makes me believe in a God, because clearly I was supposed to be there. I didn't entirely want to be there, but once I got in there and started getting into the classes, I was really glad I was there. It was incredibly intense. Obviously, basically 4 classes plus all of your other course load and everything. We had wicked long reading lists and tons of papers that we had to write. And so it was really intense, but I excelled in those classes. I found them absolutely fascinating. The ability to have an open discussion about things that growing up were absolutely prescribed, and the concept of looking up opposing beliefs without having it couched in this is the Christian perspective of this other belief, but to just look at those other beliefs on face value with their direct sources, their primary sources, was an entirely new thing for me. It was not really allowed previously. So I really got to understand things a lot better than I had when I was younger. I think that's true for a lot of us when we go to college. So I was especially taken with ontology, the ontological argument, primarily with St. Anselm, and existentialism. Descartes was an amazing influence. I don't particularly prescribe to his thought, but it is certainly a fun thought experiment to take part in and to consider as you are looking at different views of the mind-body problem. That same year, The Matrix came out. And so me and my little study group of honors nerds were absolutely obsessed. Of course, we scraped together the money of, what college kids have, so we could pile into whoever had a car and drive to the next big town over that actually had a theater. And then after seeing it, we were obsessed about talking about it in the context of our philosophy class. And one of our discussions, we had gotten out of class and we had all kind of migrated to this common area in the arts building, And one of our professors, our philosophy professor, walked by, and we roped him into our discussion, and we had this just amazing discussion about existentialism and nihilism and how those things are expressed in art and what we can take from that, and just putting forth wild ideas of how that could be extrapolated and the different ways that it could be taken. And it was just an amazing time. Discussions like that were pretty common with me and my study nerds. It was really, really helpful to have that surrounding, to be able to be curious. In following school, my very first private email account was actually based off of the ontological argument. I won't tell you what my email was, but yeah, it was related to the ontological argument. Now, in the simplest terms, the ontological argument says that because you can conceive of a being that is greater than anything else that can possibly exist, then that being must necessarily exist. It's very similar to I think, therefore I am. I conceive of the existence of myself, therefore I must necessarily exist. This is circular reasoning, though. It raises a supposition to an axiom, an uncertain belief, to a statement which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. The same thing is done with the proofs of the divinity of the Bible. The scripture must be correct and divinely inspired because it says so. Most arguments for the existence of God rely on an empirical premise. The cosmological argument for motion states that since everything that moves in our world is moved by another object, there must necessarily be an unmoved mover, that first object that moved before anything else did. The cosmological argument from efficient cause states that life is a sequence of events, and so therefore there must have been a first cause, that first piece in the chain of events that have happened through time. The cosmological argument from necessary being argues that because existence of anything in our world requires the existence of some other thing, there must exist a being that is not dependent on any other thing. The cosmological argument from gradation says everything exists on a gradient or spectrum of goodness, so there must be an absolute good. The teleological argument says that the intricate design of life and natural processes implies a great designer. All of these arguments begin with the empirical premise of objects in motion are put in motion by another object. Life can be seen as a sequence of events because of the way humans experience time. Any given thing in the world depends on some other thing, animals on food, plants on water and sunlight, or that there is intricate design in life. By comparison, Descartes and ontology rely on the item in question to prove its own existence. As I was deconstructing through these classes, I thought, why can I see the flaw in the ontological argument but feel so much truth in the Descartes philosophy of the mind-body problem? This paired with a growing symptom of bipolar and trauma, which is the dissociation and derealization that we talked about earlier, all that definitely caused some issues. I would be working on a paper about the mind-body problem and seriously struggling on deciding what the point was that I was going to make because I was so shook by realizing how subjective everything is. There was security in having those scary questions answered for you, all resulting in a it's all in God's plan or God is in control. I didn't need to know what I thought, only what I was supposed to think. But pesky life experience puts cracks in the dam and questions come tumbling out. An adult you has to contend with all the unanswered questions and accept that some questions will never concretely be answered. I came from a sheltered world of black and white to discover the real world is mostly gray. In those early days, it felt like questioning God's existence was a tacit denial of God, or at least the definition of God that I had been raised with. And the unforgivable sin was to deny God and his gift of salvation. At the same time, I was taught to seek God and his will in my life and to test all things by the scripture, regardless of who told it to me, including parents, pastors, etc. All of that implied that questions were okay, but one must only determine the veracity on sola scriptura. I was trying to reckon if these were dialectics, opposing beliefs that can be true at the same time, or if they were contradictory. At the time, I tried to treat them as dialectics, but it still felt like I was cheating, because in order to compare the biblical statements with opposing ones, it meant that I had to give some sort of veracity to the secular arguments and sources. I really don't think I would have been able to give myself permission to be as curious as I was if I had not been in that Christian university. Since I was still firmly in when I initially got to college, there was that anxiety in the back of my head that if I am not producing fruit, then I am not actually saved and destined for eternal torture. To me at the time, fruit was an effective witness. If I could not give a convincing witness to an unsaved person, I am in trouble. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man who asketh you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. 1 Peter 3:15, with an extra helping of fear for me. And how can I give an effective witness when I was questioning that concrete belief in the very existence of God, let alone how that God wanted us to worship him, or if he wanted to be worshipped? I struggled with that for years. At a point, I was so disillusioned with the church as an entity and how the God of the Bible could possibly be rationalized that I just said, fuck it. God doesn't exist. I will not be taking questions. Here you can see me modeling one of my favorite dysfunctional coping mechanisms, avoidance. But at the time, for my own sanity, I needed to put the debate to rest. I was too close to the years where I was the true believer, TM, and the pain of the trauma was just too fresh. One of the greatest hardships of trauma is that the whole point is that the initial thing was too painful for us to function through, and so revisiting that in the interest of healing is even more painful. There are absolutely times where it is not safe for us to do that healing work, but we are still plagued by the dysfunctional coping skills and symptoms that affect our ability to function. Not to get off on too much of a soapbox, but I do want to digress for a moment. As I'm thinking about how trauma can put us into a period where we are not safe to heal, but we are still negatively affected nonetheless, I think about the arguments for programs for the homeless. All too often, people will argue that there's plenty of existing resources. People just don't want to access those existing resources because they're too prideful, they have mental illness, they have drug addiction, etc. But they will never critically examine exactly what and how services are rendered in a given area. Most shelters will only let you keep certain personal items. You can't bring your pets. These people do not have access to professionals who could get them ESA or service dog status for those pets. They may not be able to keep families together, may not be allowed to stay more than a set number of hours, and there's no guarantee they will have room for you when you come back the next night. You may not be allowed to stay in the correct gendered shelter, etc., etc. And add on to this, yes, some people do refuse mental health resources, usually because they have been previously mistreated and have trauma from mental health professionals, from addiction coaches, etc. The unhoused and those on Medicaid are often treated differently than patients from other socioeconomic backgrounds, partly due to limitations in who they are able to see based on cost and availability, and partly due to, unfortunately, prevalent internal biases about the unhoused, chronically poor, or marginalized communities which are, of course, at higher risk of being in lower socioeconomic classes. That trauma is fresh. They are in the middle of being unhoused, and they are not likely in a safe place to confront it by making themselves vulnerable to another provider when they have been mistreated before. We still need to give them viable options for support and shelter that is not dependent on them remaining in some sort of recovery program. We need to distance those things. Yes, those recovery programs should be available to these people, but they should not be required. Okay, enough of my soapbox. Back to deconstruction. So I went through several years where I was learning about different religions because of my love of history, and I had found my old Intro to Philosophy book in a box while I was moving. I looked at a few different streams of paganism, mostly Druidry, which was especially fun because most primary sources of information about it were destroyed when the Romans invaded. So I really had to turn on my sleuth brain and go into massive info search mode. Intellectually, Druidry was very interesting because it was polytheistic. The definitions and limitations of gods were very different from the evangelical God, and they believed in unity rather than duality. Everything is a little bit of everything else. We have a shared experience. There is no such thing as a solitary experience. This, of course, brought up my ontological and existential questions. I spent a lot of time meditating and journaling. No, I do not have the journals, sadly. And as I thought over this, I ended up really never jiving with the Druidic concepts entirely. So, I kept looking for other faiths that would meet me where I am. I had a cursory knowledge of Judaism after being raised in a Zionist family, but of course it was all through the lens of Christianity, and it was full of assumptions and inaccuracies. I decided to look up direct sources and start studying Judaism. For most Jewish people, God is a vague higher power or spiritual force, not the intimately directing personage that I had grown up with. The focus was on living an ethical and moral life, remembering the Shoah, working for justice and equality, being intellectually curious, and carrying on traditions. This immediately vibed with me. It supported and encouraged rather than constrained and discouraged my curiosity. It recognized that it's important to be mindful of our impact on others and live in a way that puts more good in the world than bad. And to recognize the impact that we are having on people in this life, not just what impact we will have in the purported afterlife. And we remind ourselves of these values every year as we move through the cycle of celebrations and remembrances. As Matisyahu said, these rites keep me right. Through all of this, I determined that questions like existence of ourselves and God will be debated to the end of time, and finding those answers are not necessary for living a good, honest, and valid life. In fact, trying to pin all of your beliefs onto an impossible proof is a thought-terminating exercise that will never lead to true security without shutting off your brain. You know how people that are trying to convince themselves of something are the ones that will spend the most time obsessively trying to make their point over and over and get people to agree with them despite a lack of evidence. At least in my experience, that was a major motivator in winning others to Christ. If I can get others to believe this with me, it validates my belief. But as I was deconstructing, I found convincing others much less important to me. It became easier to converse with more people that had differing opinions from me, who had different life experiences, who had different religious perspectives, who are on different levels of the political spectrum. I could express my feelings on the matter, and they could counter with some other statement or belief, and it wasn't an offensive and unthinkable thing that they disagreed with me. We might debate the finer points of where we differ, but it was always in a sincerely open mind with the desire to find common ground, not to necessarily win one side over the other. Obviously, there are limitations to that with homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, etc. But for the most part, I was able to have these beautiful, engaging discussions with people who were from different life experiences, and it was beautiful to see the vast array of belief. Quick rewind back. When I was at the Christian University, we were required to do missionary service of some sort on top of school and everything else. Initially, I chose Sunday school teacher, but when the other teacher from my university, who happened to be my ride, got busted by the FBI for CSAM, that clearly ended. They were on me to pick a new service, but since it was the middle of the year, all the good ones were gone, and basically all that was left was street witnessing. Street witnessing is where they would get a bunch of college kids, throw them into a van, drive them to the next metro city over, drop them off on a random street corner, and send them out in like 3 to 4 person groups to witness and try to convert random people on the street, in the shops, etc. We had to spend basically all evening doing this. I think it was every other weekend. I was so conflicted doing this because it felt so gross to be imposing ourselves upon these random people that are just trying to go to Kroger to pick up some groceries. They're 99.9% sure they're not looking to be converted to some religion or join an MLM or buy crypto. But at the same time, I was questioning the veracity of Christianity and the Christian God, so I was quite possibly the worst equipped person to convince someone to become Christian. I'd be talking to people and they would counteract some Christianese statement that I made with whatever their belief was, and internally I'm like, that's a really good point. But of course I can't express any of that. I can't acknowledge any of that openly. I have to keep that to myself and pretend that I think you're wrong and this is why. These days I really only get preachy when it comes to people doing things that are going to harm others in this life, rather than being stuck on making sure everyone ends up in the same heaven as me. I agree with most Jews that God is a spiritual force. They do exist, just not as I understood them growing up. I follow my religion because it points me back to my ethical and moral values that are important to me. However, I do not need to prove that to anyone. I have had people send me verses talking about why Jesus is the Messiah, or why the law of Moses is no more, or whatever. And I simply do not engage in those. I'm still a convert. I don't really know enough to have a substantial debate about why those things don't work. I can give basic responses because of what I have read from rabbinical writings, but I do not consider myself any sort of expert outside of just, the limited experience that I have had. So yeah, that's just not something that I engage on. Spending my limited time and energy devoting to attempting to prove I'm doing it right is a waste of time when I could just be doing things that put good into the world.